Hey guys, tonight we begin with you, an unsuspecting time traveler foolish enough to land in the mud-soaked madness of medieval Europe. Yeah, from castles that leak to peasants that don't. It's a world where chivalry dies faster than hygiene. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. If you're time traveling to medieval Europe, your biggest danger isn't the plague or a sword, it's your shampoo. The moment you show up smelling like coconut or mountain breeze, congratulations. You've just announced to everyone within sniffing distance that you are either possessed, royal, or about to be burned alive for sorcery. You see, in the Middle Ages, smelling bad wasn't shameful. It was normal. The average peasant's scent could peel paint. Most people hadn't seen a bathtub, and the ones who did thought water carried disease, which, to be fair, it did, but so did everything else. Bathing was viewed as suspiciously sensual. The church decided that sharing bath water might lead to impure thoughts, which is funny considering no one could even see through the steam and filth. Public baths were eventually shut down for being dens of sin, as if anyone could feel romantic surrounded by 30 naked strangers and an overwhelming aroma of wet cabbage. If you pop out of your time machine freshly showered, locals won't see hygiene. They'll see sorcery. They'll assume you've been blessed or cursed by forces unknown. How do you smell like flowers when you live in a swamp? They'll ask right before calling the nearest priest to examine you with holy water that smells like old soup. So your first survival step, get filthy immediately. Roll in mud, hug a pig, sleep in hay, whatever it takes. The goal is to achieve that authentic medieval aroma. Equal parts smoke, sweat, and mild regret. You want to smell like someone who hasn't seen hope in 3 harvests. And don't think the nobles were any better. They just covered the rot with perfume, gallons of it. Imagine roses, musk, and body odor having a knife fight. That's what a medieval banquet smelled like. Their teeth were rotting, their clothes unwashed, and yet they were convinced the real sinners were the ones who bathed twice a month. So remember, in medieval Europe, your modern cleanliness is a death sentence. You don't want to smell good. You want to smell period accurate. If someone wrinkles their nose at you, relax. That's not disgust. That's acceptance. You finally blend it in. If you're planning to drink water in medieval Europe, don't. That's not hydration. That's suicide by bacteria. Back then, water wasn't clear. It was a challenge. Every sip was like spinning the plague wheel and hoping it didn't land on explosive dysentery. The average river was a medieval smoothie, a nutritious blend of mud, dead fish, and whatever the guy upstream was dumping into it. And by whatever, I mean human waste, animal waste, and occasionally actual humans. So yes, people drank beer. Not for the taste, not for fun, but because it was the only thing keeping civilization from dehydrating to death. Ale wasn't strong. Maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough to kill germs and your ambitions for the day. It was called small beer, and everyone drank it. Men, women, even toddlers. Picture a 3-year-old stumbling around with a wooden mug, slurring something about grain taxes. That was childhood. Morning, beer, lunch, beer, church, light beer out of respect. Water was so distrusted that if you refused ale, people assumed you were either insane or plotting something. In fact, refusing a drink was borderline heresy. The tavern was the social heart of every village, a place where deals were made, songs were sung, and someone inevitably got stabbed over spilled me. And before you imagined cozy pubs with polished mugs and cheerful laughter, no. Medieval taverns were sticky, smoky rooms full of shouting men, suspicious soup, and the overwhelming smell of regret. The house ale was usually brewed by someone who measured ingredients using intuition and desperation. If it didn't make you sick, you tipped them extra, travelers had it even worse. The further you went, the riskier the brew. By the time you reached a new village, you'd be lucky to get something that hadn't fermented into bread. That's why most time travelers in theory would never make it home, not because of paradoxes, but because of intestinal collapse by day 3. So take my advice. If you find yourself in the 14th century, forget your fancy micro-filtered water bottle. Order the ale, say a prayer, and don't ask what's floating in it. In medieval Europe, beer wasn't a beverage. It was life support. If you take one piece of advice from this entire time travel guide, let it be this. Don't argue with the church. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't a belief system. It was Wi-Fi. Everyone was connected. No one understood how it worked, and if you lost signal, you were probably going to hell. The church wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was government, news, healthcare, and moral surveillance all rolled into one judgmental package. Every hour of your day belonged to God, and his middle management was everywhere. There were monks counting sins, priests collecting tithes, bishops hoarding gold, and the Pope sitting in Rome like the CEO of Eternal Consequences, Inc. Now, you might think your modern rational brain can handle this. You've read books. You understand science. Please don't. The moment you say something like, actually, the Earth goes around the sun, congratulations, you've invented heresy. That's a one-way ticket to an audience with a man holding a torch and a very poor understanding of astronomy. Even asking questions was dangerous. If you wondered aloud why prayers didn't cure the plague, you were doubting divine will. If you asked why the priest owned 3 horses while you couldn't afford a loaf of bread, you were testing God. The only safe phrases to say were, Amen, and God works in mysterious ways, preferably while backing away slowly. And don't even think about skipping church. Attendance wasn't optional. Bells rang, everyone dropped what they were doing, and off you went to spend 3 hours listening to sermons in Latin, a language nobody understood except the priest, who was usually drunk anyway. If you didn't show up, the neighbors would notice. And in medieval Europe, the neighbors noticed is how every execution starts. The church controlled education, money, medicine, and most importantly, fear. That's how it stayed in charge for 1,000 years. Not by convincing people it was right, but by making sure no one lived long enough to prove it wrong. So if you time travel back, remember this. Don't debate theology, don't mention science, and definitely don't say, I'm spiritual but not religious. They'll think it's Latin for please light me on fire. If you catch anything in medieval Europe, a cough, a rash, or just a vague sense of doom, I have some excellent advice. Don't go to the doctor. That's because doctor in the 14th century didn't mean someone who saves your life. It meant someone with a book, a robe, and a hammering sense of confidence. These were men who genuinely believed disease was caused by demons, bad smells, or an unfortunate alignment of Mars and your liver. Their treatments were bold, creative, and catastrophically wrong. Got a fever, you're too hot. They'll bleed you until you're balanced. Feeling weak, you're too cold. They'll set you on fire, metaphorically or literally. If you have a headache, their first solution is drilling a small hole in your skull to let the evil spirits out. The success rate was approximately none. Hospitals existed, but you didn't want to visit them. They were basically waiting rooms for the afterlife. Crowded, loud, and conveniently located next to cemeteries for faster service. Monks ran most of them, which meant half the medicine you received was prayer, and the other half was bleeding you while asking if you'd sinned recently. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, gloves, or the faintest idea of sanitation. Instruments weren't cleaned. They were wiped on the nearest tunic and reused until they broke or screamed. If you survived surgery, congratulations. You now had a new infection to die from. Dentistry was handled by barbers because why not? You'd go in for a shave and leave missing half your jaw. These were the same men who'd also happily amputate your leg and then offer you a discount on a haircut. So if you get sick while time traveling, resist the urge to seek help, rest, drink ale, and pray to every available deity. It's not that medieval doctors were evil. They were just aggressively confident in centuries of nonsense. Remember, in the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't about curing disease. It was about surviving the treatment long enough to regret it. If you think showing up in medieval Europe wearing your favorite hoodie will make you blend in, let me save your life. It won't. You might as well tattoo "suspicious stranger" on your forehead, because in the Middle Ages, fashion was a crime scene and the authorities had receipts. Europe had what were called sumptuary laws, legal dress codes designed to keep everyone in their social lane. The idea was simple. If you're poor, you'd better look poor. No bright colors, no fancy fabric, no jewelry unless you stole it. Even the wrong type of hat could get you fined, flogged, or both. These laws weren't just suggestions. They were moral statements. Silk for nobles only. Fur for people who owned land, not goats, velvet. Reserved for anyone rich enough to pay someone else to be cold for them. The rules were so specific that even buttons could betray you. Some towns literally had ordinances on how shiny your belt buckle was allowed to be. So if you time travel in wearing polyester or, God forbid, sneakers, you'll break at least 3 medieval commandments before breakfast. Your futuristic fabrics will make you look like a demon or worse, a flamboyant merchant. Either way, the local priest will want a word. Even the upper classes weren't safe. Nobles competed over who could look more impractically wealthy. Long, pointy shoes were the fashion. So long, in fact, they had to be tied to the knees with string. Some were nearly 2 ft long. Medieval men were basically walking around dressed like aggressive ducks. Women had it no better. Their gowns could weigh 30 lb and drag through mud long enough to collect souvenirs. Corsets, not yet, but good luck breathing under 10 layers of wool. The best survival strategy: dress like a peasant. Brown, itchy, and unmemorable. Your goal is to look like background furniture, the kind that coughs quietly and gets ignored by passing knights. So remember, in medieval Europe, fashion wasn't self-expression. It was self-incrimination. Blend in, stay drab, and if someone compliments your outfit, apologize. That's not flattery, it's evidence. You might think medieval Europe is full of charming creatures, loyal dogs, fluffy cats, majestic horses trotting through the mist. That's the fairy tale version. The real version bites, kicks, infects, or screams at you. Do not pet anything that moves. Let's start with dogs. Forget man's best friend. Medieval dogs were working animals, lean, scarred, and emotionally unavailable. They hunted rats, guarded barns, and occasionally dined on whatever died first. They weren't good boys. They were furry survivalists with mange. If you tried to call one over and say, "Who's a good boy?" the answer was not him. Cats, you might think they'd be safer. They weren't. They were half wild, perpetually furious, and considered suspicious by the church. People actually killed cats for being witches' familiars, which led to surprise, more rats, more fleas, and eventually the Black Death. Congratulations, humanity, you murdered pest control. Horses were just as bad. You may imagine gallant knights riding noble steeds. In reality, horses were unpredictable tanks with teeth. They bit, kicked, and bolted at the first sign of a spoon dropping. A medieval warhorse could trample you out of pure boredom. You'd have better odds cuddling a bear. Farm animals were worse. Chickens weren't cute. They were tiny, feathered sociopaths. Pigs were intelligent, but their intelligence mainly went into figuring out how to eat you. If you tripped, sheep constantly plotting to die of fright. Geese walking security systems powered by hatred and disease. Oh, the disease. Rabies, ringworm, lice, fleas, worms. Every creature carried something you don't want. Petting a random animal was basically medieval roulette. You either got bitten, infected, or accused of witchcraft for charming the beast. If you time travel back and feel lonely, resist the urge to bond with local fauna. Animals in the Middle Ages weren't companions. They were co-workers who didn't like you. You'll meet pigs smarter than peasants, dogs meaner than knights, and cats who have seen things that make hell look cozy. So, say distance, because in medieval Europe, every animal is either dinner, disease, or demon, and you don't want to find out which is which. If you plan to smile in medieval Europe, don't. Teeth were less a body part and more a short-term rental. Dentistry, as we know it, didn't exist, at least not in a form any sane person would recognize. Oral hygiene was a rumor, and most people's mouths looked like archaeological digs from hell. Toothbrushes, none. Toothpaste, not invented. Mouthwash, occasionally vinegar, but mostly regret. Peasants chewed on twigs or rinsed with wine, which sounds fancy until you remember the wine was made in a bucket. The rich had better access to dentistry, which usually meant some barber named Griot yanking your mur out with pliers he'd just used to sharpen a sword. Barbers were the go-to medical professionals because they had tools and the confidence of men who'd never studied anatomy. You could walk into a shop for a trim and leave missing both your hair and your sense of trust. Their logic was simple. If it hurts, remove it. If it still hurts, bleed you. If you die, that's on your humors. Tooth decay was rampant. Sugar was rare, but bread, beer, and plague stress took their toll. By 30, most people had gums that resembled battlefield terrain. Nobles didn't fare better. They just hid it behind perfume and prayer. A healthy smile was such a rarity that chronic halitosis probably counted as a personality trait. And there were no fillings, no anesthetics, no antibiotics. If your tooth hurt, you prayed. If that failed, you went to a blacksmith who'd help by heating an iron and applying it to your jaw. This apparently cured the pain because you stopped caring about your teeth entirely. So, if you're time traveling, protect your mouth like it's your soul. Don't eat the bread. It's basically gravel. Don't drink the water. It's basically poison. And don't trust anyone holding tongs. Keep your mouth closed. It's the most valuable treasure you've got. Because in medieval Europe, everyone loses their teeth. Some lose them naturally. Others lose them to medicine. But either way, by the end of your trip, you'll be gumming your ale and smiling through the pain. Historically accurate, if nothing else. If you're time traveling to medieval Europe, remember this golden rule. Everything you eat is trying to kill you. The diet wasn't so much farm-toteable as hope to God it's edible. Let's start with bread, the universal staple and the leading cause of dental trauma. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and baked from grains so coarse it could double as sandpaper. The poorest made loaves with barley, rye, and occasionally crushed peas or acorns. Sometimes they added filler, which was a charming euphemism for sawdust, weeds, or whatever was lying near the mill. It wasn't food, it was survival in loaf form. If you were lucky enough to eat meat, congratulations. You were probably nobility or robbing one. The meat wasn't fresh either. It was smoked, salted, or slightly haunted. Refrigeration didn't exist, so aging was just what happened when you forgot to bury the pig fast enough. Spices were used not for flavor, but for camouflage. If your dinner smelled suspiciously like cinnamon, it meant someone was hiding the decay. Vegetables, a peasant luxury. Nobles avoided them entirely. Too common, too earthy. They preferred heavily spiced dishes that looked impressive and tasted like moral punishment. Meanwhile, peasants lived on pottage, a stew that evolved perpetually in the same pot for months. You'd throw in barley, cabbage, and despair, boil it for 6 hours, and call it dinner. It was said a good pottage could survive generations, and probably did. Dessert was rare unless you considered fermented apples and regret a delicacy. Sweets required sugar, which cost a fortune. Most people's idea of a treat was bread soaked in ale, the medieval equivalent of cake, if you hate yourself. And don't forget the cutlery, or rather the lack of it. Forks were foreign nonsense, knives were communal, and spoons were shared like bacteria exchange programs. Eating with your hands was normal. Washing those hands before eating was optional. So if you find yourself in a medieval feast hall, eat slowly, pretend to enjoy it, and try not to think about expiration dates. Everything's boiled, salted, or possibly moving. In medieval Europe, fresh mint hasn't killed anyone yet. Bon appetit. If you think medieval Europe was full of noble kings and wise rulers, allow me to ruin that fantasy. It was actually full of people getting executed for thinking about kings and rulers. So, here's the best advice for your trip through the Middle Ages. Keep your head down unless you'd like to lose it. Politics in medieval Europe made no sense. You could go to bed under one king and wake up under another, and neither of them knew where your village was. Loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was punished. Swear allegiance to the wrong noble, and congratulations, you've just committed treason in advance. Monarchs changed faster than tavern prices. Assassinations, coups, poisonings, accidental hunting trips. Royal deaths were basically a spectator sport. It didn't matter who you supported. You were always on the losing side. Even cheering could get you killed. People were executed for clapping at the wrong time. And don't think being quiet will save you. Spies were everywhere in markets, churches, taverns, even your own home. Gossip traveled faster than hygiene. One wrong comment about taxes, and suddenly you're a threat to the crown. They didn't need evidence, just enthusiasm. You could be executed politely. Public beheadings were entertainment. People brought their kids. Vendors sold snacks. Come see the traitor lose his head was basically medieval Netflix. And the worst part, sometimes the axe didn't work properly. It could take multiple swings. You'd die knowing the crowd was getting bored. If you were noble, your execution was at least fancy. You got a private scaffold and maybe a priest. But if you were a commoner, you were lucky to get decapitated. The default setting was hanging, burning, or being tied to something uncomfortable. So, what's the survival strategy? Don't speak, don't choose sides, don't look like you have opinions. When nobles argue, stare at your shoes. When they ask where you're from, say around. Never say the future. That's heresy and treason. A 2 for one deal at the gallows. In short, keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your passport hidden. In medieval Europe, silence isn't just golden. It's life insurance. If you somehow survive the plague, bad bread, and casual executions, your next challenge will be conversation. Medieval Europe loved to talk, just never about anything safe, which is why you should learn one very important phrase before time traveling. Nescio, it means I don't know, and you should use it constantly. The Middle Ages were full of arguments you couldn't win because facts didn't exist yet. You're a 21st century traveler surrounded by people who think thunder is God bowling, and that babies are conceived via divine lightning bolt. You might feel tempted to correct them. Don't. That's how Galileo ended up on house arrest for having a telescope. If a monk asks what you think about the Trinity, say Nescio. If a scholar asks whether the earth moves, say Nescio. If a peasant asks why their cow exploded, definitely say Nescio. Any attempt to explain science will get you branded as either a sorcerer or French, and neither is survivable. Medieval intellectual debates were terrifying. They didn't involve ideas. They involved stakes, torches, and accusations. Philosophy wasn't about discovery. It was about seeing who could quote Aristotle without getting set on fire. The smartest man in the room was usually the one pretending to be illiterate. Latin was the language of the educated elite, priests, lawyers, and anyone who could afford to be wrong in multiple syllables. But for you it's a shield. Say Nescio with conviction, bow a little, and they'll think you're humble or foreign, not dangerous. And in this world, humble foreigners live longer than clever locals. If you're dragged into a theological debate, and you will be, remember that reason is not your friend. You can't outlogic faith with science that won't be discovered for another 500 years. When someone insists disease is caused by sin, the correct response is not actually bacteria. It's Nescio followed by intense nodding. So practice it now. Neo, Nitio, Nitio. It's not ignorance. It's survival, because in medieval Europe, the less you know, the less you burn. In the 21st century, you live by clocks. In medieval Europe, you live by bells, and they're not asking, they're commanding. If you hear one, drop whatever you're doing. The bell is God's version of a push notification. Bells ruled everything. They woke you up, told you when to pray, when to work, when to confess, and when to panic because someone's house was on fire. Every town had at least one church tower, and its bell rang so often that silence was considered suspicious. The day was carved into chunks of noise. Matins, lords, prime, ter, sex, nun, vespers, and compline. Basically, divine interval training for the soul. Monks took this very seriously. Their entire lives were synchronized by bells like spiritual factory workers. At 3:00 a.m., the bell rang for matins and everyone rolled out of bed to chant in Latin for 2 hours. At 6:00 a.m., another bell told them to eat bread that tasted like despair, then back to chanting. It's a wonder anyone found time to sin. Peasants, meanwhile, didn't need a watch. They had trauma. The bells told them when to plow, when to rest, when to pay taxes, and when to beg for forgiveness for complaining about taxes. When the bells rang, everyone obeyed. They didn't ask why. They just knew someone important. Possibly God, possibly Gregor, the bell ringer, had decided it was time to stop having fun. Bells weren't just for prayers. They signaled danger, weddings, executions, royal visits, or plague outbreaks. If the bell sounded at an odd hour, panic was the correct emotional response. Some bells rang so often they developed names and personalities. Big Tom, Great Peter, the Waker of the Dead, and they weren't exaggerating. These things could be heard for miles. If you're time-traveling, your first instinct might be to ignore them. Don't. That's like ignoring fire alarms in a fireworks factory. If the bell rings, follow the crowd. Don't ask questions. Don't make jokes about alarm fatigue. The medieval mind doesn't understand sarcasm, only obedience. In medieval Europe, the bell doesn't just tell time, it owns it. If you thought medieval Europe was all chivalry, serenades, and moonlit castle balconies, congratulations. You've been catfished by centuries of bad poetry. Romance in the Middle Ages was less Romeo and Juliet and more catch feelings. Catch the plague. Let's start with the basics. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, and alliances, the holy trinity of disappointment. Nobles didn't marry for affection. They married for acreage. Your spouse was chosen when you were about 6, and your wedding vows were legally binding property contracts disguised as spiritual devotion. If you were a peasant, things weren't better, just cheaper. Courtship involved less poetry and more mud. You'd meet someone while milking a cow, exchange a few shy glances, and boom, you're married because the village priest needed something to do that week. Flirting, on the other hand, was dangerous. If you complimented the wrong person, congratulations. You've just triggered a blood feud. Nobles defended honor the way modern people defend why. 5 passwords. A single misplaced smile could get you stabbed, fined, or dragged before the local lord for intent to woo above your station. Romantic ambition was practically a death wish, and affairs, oh, absolutely, they happened all the time. Discretion didn't. Every noble court was a soap opera with chain mail. But if you got caught, the punishment depended on your gender. Men were scolded, women were executed, and priests took notes for their next sermon. There were songs, of course, courtly love. The idea that a knight could pine for a married lady without consequences. It was poetic, dramatic, and completely fictional. In reality, knights were filthy, women were exhausted, and troubadours were banned from at least 3 duchies at any given time. If you time travel to medieval Europe, keep your heart and your eyes to yourself. Complimenting a noble's wife means execution. Flirting with a peasant's daughter means lynching. Even smiling too long could get you excommunicated for lustful gazing. In short, romance is fatal. The safest relationship you'll have in the Middle Ages is with your straw mattress, though even that comes with splinters. So stay single, stay silent, and stay alive. In medieval Europe, love at first sight was usually followed by trial at first light. If you somehow survive medieval food, politics, and romance, congratulations. You're now ready for everyone's favorite community activity, the witch hunt. Think of it as a medieval talent show, except the talent is dying creatively. In the Middle Ages, witch hunts were the perfect storm of boredom, fear, and bad theology. The weather was bad, crops failed, and people needed someone to blame who wasn't the local lord. Enter the witch, usually an old woman with a cat, arthritis, and the audacity to live alone. The logic was flawless. If your cow stopped producing milk, a witch cursed it. If your child sneezed twice, witchcraft. If your bread burned, witchcraft. If your bread didn't burn, especially witchcraft. The only person not accused was the actual idiot who left the oven unattended. Trials were generous affairs. You'd be tied up, thrown into a river, and told that if you floated, you were a witch. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. This was considered fair. Either way, the church got to keep your property, so it was a win. Win for everyone except you. Witch finders were professionals, self-appointed experts with impressive titles and questionable literacy. They'd inspect moles, freckles, or birthmarks as devil's marks. Basically, if you had skin, you were guilty. They also used needles to test if you felt pain. If you didn't scream, you were a witch. If you did, they said you screamed like a witch. So, what should you do as a time traveler? Easy. Blend in. Don't heal anyone. Don't use herbs. Don't even know herbs. If someone gets sick, say God's will, not maybe it's bacteria. Don't own a cat. Don't talk to birds. And, for the love of all that's holy, don't float. Witch hunts weren't rare. They were entertainment. People showed up with snacks. The church called it justice. Nobles called it order. And peasants called it a nice day out. So if the crowd starts gathering torches and shouting witch, walk away fast. Because in medieval Europe, everyone's a witch until proven drowned. There are sounds you never forget. Church bells, clanging swords, a suspicious cough. And then there's this one. Bring out your dead. If you hear that in medieval Europe, don't stick around to see what happens next. It's not a parade. It's not a sale. It's the Black Death, the world's least festive block party. The plague hit in waves, and every time it did, people lost their collective minds. Cities emptied, villages vanished. The average street looked like a horror movie filmed with a shovel. And since nobody understood germs, they blamed everything else. Jews, witches, bad smells, and the position of Mars. Basically, everything except the rats and fleas literally crawling over their faces. When the carts rolled through town, they were collecting bodies. No gloves, no masks, no sense of self-preservation, just men shouting, "Bring out your dead," while stepping over yesterday's quatota. If you were lucky, you died fast. If not, you got to enjoy a week of fever, black boils, and spiritual panic before joining the pile. Doctors, if you can call them that, wore long beaked masks stuffed with herbs, because apparently lavender could stop divine wrath. These plague doctors looked like goth stalks and were about as effective. They carried sticks to poke patients from a distance, which honestly was the smartest medical decision of the century. The living didn't fare much better. People fled cities, abandoning family and reason. Some turned to prayer, others to alcohol. A few decided the world was ending and joined flag cults that whipped themselves through town like sinners on parade. Spoiler, it didn't help. So, if you time travel to medieval Europe and hear that infamous call echoing through the fog, do not investigate. Do not offer help. Do not Google symptoms. Just leave quietly, quickly, preferably in the opposite direction of the coughing, because in the Middle Ages there's no such thing as safe distance. The plague travels faster than gossip, and it doesn't need an invitation. If you value your life or your skin tone, respect the cart and keep moving. Remember, curiosity didn't just kill the cat. In the 14th century, it killed everyone. So, you've made it through the filth, famine, and fever. You've blended in, you smell like despair, and you've mastered the art of not dying. Naturally, you start to think, hey, maybe medieval life isn't so bad. That's your first mistake. Because the moment you relax, something terrible happens. Maybe the harvest fails. Maybe the local baron decides to start a war over a goat. Maybe the sky darkens and everyone starts chanting in Latin because a comet showed up, and clearly that means apocalypse. In medieval Europe, comfort isn't a feeling, it's an omen. You could spend years surviving plagues, invasions, and suspicious bread, only to wake up one morning and discover you're now owned by someone named Lord Geoffrey, the slightly moist. Your home his, your livestock also his, your freedom optional, and if you complain, congratulations. You're a heretic and a socialist. Even peace wasn't peaceful. Fires broke out constantly because everything was made of wood and optimism. Floods drowned half the countryside at least once a decade. The rest of the time, people were freezing, starving, or waiting for someone to invent soap. And if you think moving to a castle will help, think again. Castles were basically drafty stone refrigerators full of angry nobles and indoor smoke. You die slower but not happier. Peasants had at least the dignity of freezing outside. The truth is no one in the Middle Ages was comfortable. They were alive temporarily, painfully, and usually against their will. But they were also stubbornly human, laughing, drinking, singing badly, and finding joy in a world that constantly tried to kill them. There's something admirable about that in a tragic, license-fisted sort of way. So, when you time travel home, do yourself a favor. Take a hot shower, brush your teeth, and marvel at your miracle of indoor plumbing. Then light a candle for the poor souls who never got to complain about traffic or Wi-Fi. Because comfort, the kind we take for granted, is the one luxury nobody in medieval Europe ever truly had. The Roman arena was not a place of mercy. Beneath the blinding sun and roaring crowds, men fought for their lives, their sweat mixing with sand and blood. But every so often a hush would fall over the mob, a different kind of awe replacing the usual hunger for gore, because stepping into the arena were not burly scarred men but women. They were called gladiatrices, female gladiators, and their very existence challenged everything Rome believed about gender, honor, and spectacle. These women were the empire's secret fascination. Dressed like Amazon, bare-armed, often with one breast exposed in symbolic imitation of the mythical warrior women. They fought with elegance and ferocity. Bronze greaves shimmered against oiled legs. Helms adorned with plumes or feathers hid their faces, but not their determination. For the Romans, who saw female modesty as a virtue, and public combat as a man's duty, the sight was both thrilling and disturbing. Most gladiatrices were not volunteers. Many were slaves or prisoners of war, condemned to entertain the public through violence. Yet a few came of their own free will, noble women drawn by fame, rebellion, or desire for forbidden freedom. Ancient writers like Juvenal mocked these upper-class women, sneering that they threw away the dust for the sword. But the truth was that the arena gave them something Roman society never could: a taste of equality, however brutal. They trained in special schools, learning the arts of sword, shield, and trident. Imagine the clang of steel, the rhythm of footwork, the measured breathing before a strike. They sparred just as the men did, earning the right to step onto the sands of the amphitheater, where life and death were separated by the turn of a thumb. Their matches were often lit by torches, staged as exotic spectacles, half theater, half slaughter. The audience gawked not only at their skill, but at the sheer audacity of women fighting like men. And though the empire tried to erase them from history, faint traces remain. A marble relief in Halicarnassus, showing two women, Amazon and Achilia, raising their arms in salute. An inscription honoring a female fighter who fought bravely and was freed. They were rare but real. And for a brief defiant moment, they made the arena their own. Training to become a gladiatrix was a brutal transformation, a descent into discipline, pain, and performance. For most women who entered the ludus or gladiator school, life as they knew it ended at the gate. Once inside, they were no longer wives, slaves, or nobles. They were fighters in the making, property of the arena, shaped by the lanista, the trainer who ruled their fates. The training grounds were relentless, wooden swords first to learn form and balance, then heavier weapons meant to build strength and endurance. They practiced strikes, parries, and footwork under the merciless eye of their instructors, the air rire of sweat and iron. Every mistake was corrected with a shout or a blow, but in time, rhythm replaced hesitation. A woman who once carried baskets or spun wool could now swing a gladius with precision, deadly enough to split bone. Diet was part of their conditioning, too. Contrary to popular myth, gladiators, male and female, were not sculpted warriors of lean muscle. They ate thick barley porridge, beans, and ashes, building a soft layer of fat that protected their organs from shallow cuts. The irony was almost poetic. The empire that glorified beauty and perfection bred its champions from roughness and scars. Still, training wasn't just about fighting. It was theater. Gladiatrices learned to fight with style. A dramatic entrance, a taunting pose, a deliberate pause before the final strike. These weren't just flourishes. They were strategy. The crowd demanded drama, not efficiency. The lanista would often pit them against exotic beasts or foreign fighters, choreographing their deaths and victories for maximum spectacle. And despite being outnumbered by male fighters, gladiatrices earned the respect of their peers. Many of the men, initially dismissive, learned quickly not to underestimate them. Strength could be matched, but speed and cunning, those were their true weapons. Some records mention that female recruits were even trained in the Ludus Magnus, the main gladiator school near the Colosseum, where emperors themselves sometimes came to watch practice bouts. There, a few gladiatrices became local legends, known by nicknames like Amazona or Livia the Blade. Every drop of blood spilled in training brought them closer to the arena, a stage where they would fight not just for survival, but for the impossible dream of being remembered. When the day of the games arrived, the city pulsed with anticipation. Banners fluttered above the amphitheater. Drums thundered through the streets, and the smell of roasting meat and sweat hung thick in the air. From dawn until dusk, tens of thousands gathered to watch Rome's greatest obsession, death as entertainment. But when the announcer called out the names of female gladiators, the crowd's roar changed. It became something between shock, amusement, and lust. The women entered the arena with deliberate grace, their armor gleaming beneath the sun or torch light. To the Romans, it was a scandal wrapped in spectacle. They weren't supposed to be there. Women were meant to adorn temples, not desecrate them with blood. And yet here they were, warriors draped in mythic symbolism, some dressed as Amazon from Greek legend, others bare, shouldered and defiant. Their presence alone was a form of rebellion. The games followed ritual. Trumpets blared, the emperor gave a signal, and the match began. The women fought with surprising ferocity, shields clashing, swords flashing, sand kicking up beneath their sandals. Each movement was deliberate, not only to survive, but to entertain. The crowd demanded artistry and violence, and the gladiatrices delivered. Every feint, every strike, every dodge was theater written in blood. They fought against other women, sometimes against men, and occasionally against wild beasts. Lions, bow, even leopards were released into the arena. The audience gasped as silk-haired women stood their ground against fanged death. And though most fights ended in mercy or exhaustion rather than slaughter, the line between performance and mortality was thin and cruel. Roman writers recorded these spectacles with a mix of fascination and disgust. Cassius Dio wrote of Emperor Domitian hosting nighttime games where women battled by torchlight, their bodies gleaming with oil and sweat under the flicker of flame. It was both erotic and horrifying, a calculated contradiction that kept Rome's citizens enthralled. For the gladiatrix, each match was a gamble, death, disgrace, or glory. Some were slain and forgotten. Others fought so bravely that the crowd demanded their freedom, chanting, "Missio, release." In those moments, as the crowd thundered approval and the emperor raised his hand, a woman who had been property became briefly a legend. To understand the allure of the female gladiator, one must look to the myth that inspired her, the Amazon. For the Romans, Amazon were both fantasy and fear. Women who fought, conquered, and lived without men. They existed in art, in poetry, and on the walls of villas, representing everything that Rome both admired and despised in the feminine spirit. When female fighters entered the arena dressed like these mythical warriors, they brought those fantasies to life. Artists and organizers leaned heavily into this imagery. Gladiatrices were often given stage names like Achilia, Amazon, or Pentha, directly invoking the heroines of Greek legend. Their armor, deliberately stylized, mimicked the look of mythic Amazon. Bare arms, one breast uncovered, short tunics that allowed for movement and left little to the imagination. It was deliberate theater. The audience was meant to see them not just as women, but as symbols of something untamed and dangerous. But beneath the symbolism was a quiet irony. The Amazon were said to have lived in lands beyond civilization, Sia, the fringes of the known world. They were barbarians according to Roman ideals. So when the empire paraded its own women as Amazon, it was both a spectacle and a statement of control, a reminder that Rome could tame even its myths, forcing them to fight and die for the crowd's pleasure. The women themselves, however, often embodied the opposite of submission. Whether enslaved or free, their mere presence in the arena defied centuries of Roman moral codes. They blurred the lines between virtue and vice, shame and courage. Some in the audience may have laughed or jeered, but others perhaps secretly felt admiration. Roman poets like Statius described these fighters with fascination, unable to decide whether to condemn or worship them. They were monstrous, he wrote, yet irresistible. Their duality mirrored the Amazon myth itself, half nightmare, half fantasy. Statues and mosaics from the eastern provinces captured this fascination in stone and color. Women with swords poised mid-swing, muscles tense, faces serene. These depictions were not of victims, but of equals, warriors carved in the language of defiance. And for a brief shimmering moment, the gladiatrix became more than myth or novelty. She became the living Amazon of Rome, an embodiment of rebellion gilded in bronze and blood. Winning in the arena was more than survival. It was transformation. For a gladi, a victory could mean food, gifts, fame, and in rare cases, freedom. In a world where most women's names were lost to history, these few became whispered legends. Their stories passed from tavern to tavern, from senator to slave. When a female fighter won a match, the arena erupted. Flowers were thrown into the sand. Men shouted her name with drunken admiration. Some patrons carved her likeness on oil lamps and pottery, capturing the moment when she stood over her fallen opponent, sword raised high. To the Romans, it was both shocking and seductive. A woman commanding attention, power, and applause. The greatest honor a gladiatrix could achieve was MCO, official release from combat granted by the emperor or the crowd. The wooden sword, the ruddies, symbolized her freedom. Few ever reached that point, but those who did were immortalized. Inscriptions have been found celebrating women who fought bravely and were freed. These were not meek housewives. They were conquerors of men and fate, but fame in the arena came with a dark cost. The empire's moralists despised the sight of women who sought glory in combat. Philosophers and senators ranted that such displays corrupted Roman virtue. When women fight, wrote one critic, modesty dies. It was more than outrage. It was fear. The idea of women embracing power, violence, and public admiration threatened the social order. Even emperors were torn. Domitian adored hosting spectacles featuring women fighters, while later rulers condemned them. Under Emperor Septimius says in the early 3rd century CE, the ban became law. Women were forbidden from entering the arena. Rome had indulged its fantasy for too long, and now it recoiled from what it had created. Many gladiatrices faded into obscurity, their victories erased by decree. Their names chipped off monuments, their images buried in sand, but their legacy endured in fragments of marble, in graffiti praising their skill, and in the myths they embodied. They were more than curiosities of entertainment. They were women who for a fleeting moment seized the kind of power Rome told them they could never have and forced the empire to look at them, not as ornaments but as warriors. By the 3rd century CE, the days of the gladiatrix were numbered. Rome was changing. Its empire stretched thin, its moral compass shifting from spectacle to self-control. The same elite who once paid fortunes to watch women duel beneath torchlight began to call it a disgrace. What had once been thrilling now seemed obscene, and the emperors, ever mindful of appearances, moved to erase it. Emperor Septimius says struck the final blow. Around 200 CE, he issued a decree forbidding women from performing in the arena. His official reason was moral reform, an effort to restore the dignity of Roman womanhood. But beneath the rhetoric was something deeper, fear. The sight of women fighting, and sometimes winning, undermined the patriarchal image of the empire. A female victor in the arena was not merely entertainment. She was an embarrassment to every Roman who believed that women should stay silent, obedient, and unseen. Senators praised the ban, hailing it as a return to virtue. Poets lamented the decay of modesty. The same hands that had thrown roses now signed edicts of condemnation. The public, however, was divided. Some missed the thrill, the novelty of women who moved with the grace of dancers and struck with the precision of killers. Others whispered that Rome had become weak, that the empire, which once celebrated strength, now cowed behind moral laws. The ban did not silence everyone. Evidence suggests that in smaller provincial arenas, female fighters continued to appear for years afterward, sometimes disguised as men, sometimes openly defying the law. The empire was vast, and decrees from Rome traveled slowly. In frontier towns, governors cared less about ethics and more about drawing crowds. There, the spirit of the gladiatrix refused to die, but over time, as Christianity spread and the games themselves began to fade, the memory of these women slipped into myth. Chroniclers ignored them, or twisted their stories into moral warnings. The marble reliefs that once depicted their triumphs were buried or broken. By the time the Colosseum's gates closed for good, few remembered that women had ever fought there at all. Yet even in erasure they endured. Their silence became its own rebellion, a ghostly reminder that once in the heart of Rome, women stood unflinching beneath the eyes of emperors and gods. When the gladiatrices vanished from the arena, Rome did what it always did with inconvenient truths. It rewrote them. Historians spoke of mighty generals and noblemen, but the women who had bled in the sand were quietly erased. Their names faded from scrolls, their faces from fresco. What survived was fragmentary, a marble relief here, an inscription there, whispers of a time when women dared to fight under the empire's gaze. One of the most striking relics is the Hykernas's relief showing two female fighters, Amazon and Achilia. Both stand proud, weapons raised, their bodies lean and strong. The inscription below declares the match a draw, an outcome of mutual respect, rare in the arena's cruel arithmetic. These were not slaves dying for amusement. They were equals, warriors whose skill commanded the crowd's admiration. Archaeologists have also uncovered graffiti and mosaics depicting women in armor. Their identities long lost, but their postures unmistakably defiant. Each artifact is a ghostly reminder that their existence was real, not legend. And yet, for centuries, scholars dismissed them as allegory, as artistic fantasy. It was easier to believe in mythic Amazon than to accept that Roman women once wielded swords in truth. This erasure was no accident. The empire's moralists, and later the early Christian chroniclers, sought to cleanse history of such transgressions. A woman who fought for blood and honor did not fit the narrative of obedience and piety they wanted to preserve. In their eyes, gladiatrices were not heroines, but heretics of gender, symbols of Rome's decadence and decline. But history has a way of whispering through the ruins. Modern excavations and re-examinations of ancient texts have brought these women back into the light. Their presence, once denied, now complicates the story of Rome itself. They reveal an empire far more diverse, daring, and contradictory than its marble monuments suggest. And so, while the Colosseum stones still stand, they hold within them echoes of women whose courage defied centuries of silence. Their memory may be fractured, but it endures, etched in the grit of the arena floor, in the glint of a bronze sword, and in the enduring truth that power once seized can never be entirely erased. Centuries after the last torch burned out in the Colosseum, the gladiatrix was reborn, not in flesh, but in imagination. Artists, historians, and filmmakers began to rediscover her story, fascinated by the paradox she represented. A woman both enslaved and empowered, brutal yet graceful, a product of Rome's cruelty and her own defiance. What had once been erased from memory now returned as legend. In the Renaissance, scholars studying ancient reliefs stumbled upon depictions of armed women and puzzled over their meaning. Were they mythic Amazon, goddesses, or something more human and more dangerous to the order of history? By the 19th century, archaeologists had confirmed what the ancients once knew. Women had indeed fought in the arena. The revelation scandalized and thrilled the modern world in equal measure. The image of the female gladiator soon took on new forms. Painters portrayed her as both warrior and muse, half Venus, half Mars. Writers turned her into a symbol of rebellion against patriarchal constraint. In the 20th and 21st centuries, she found new life in cinema and literature. From epic films to historical novels, often depicted as a figure of tragic strength or erotic fascination. The gladiatrix had become a cultural mirror reflecting society's shifting views on power, gender, and spectacle. But behind the fantasy, scholars worked to reclaim her truth. They pieced together evidence, inscriptions, armor fragments, burial remains to separate myth from reality. They discovered that these women were not anomalies, but part of a broader world where gender roles were less rigid than the marble statues of Roman virtue suggested. Rome's arenas, cruel as they were, had been strange laboratories of equality, where a woman's worth was measured not by her birth, but by her blade. Today, the gladiatrix stands as a symbol of historical defiance.